Nice to meet you, Mr. James.
Well, thank you for having me. It's my honor to be here.
It's an honor to meet you. I'm Kazuhiro Haraguchi, a member of the Japanese Parliament
Mhm.
and co-chair of the WCH parliamentary group, co-chair.
Mhm.
Uh, I have also served as the Minister of Internal Affairs and Communication. Very nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well, and everyone else.
Today, I'm looking forward to hearing you insight of these issues regarding the pandemic treaty and revision of the IHR, as you have been investigating them in great detail. Thank you so much.
Yep.
So please go on.
Okay. Does everyone else want to be introduced, or I can just dive right into it? How would you
Mhm.
like to go forward?
Dr. Yoshino, could you introduce yourself
Oh,
to James?
yes. My name is Toshiaki Yoshino. I am a doctor and a regenerative medicine specialist, but I'm also an acupuncturist and a Chinese harvest doctor. I'm the 11th generation.
Wow.
Oh, yeah. So, and I noticed this is a crazy situation about vaccine and new coronavirus situation in 2020. So I started to speak about this issue uh, using YouTube and other SNS. So this year, Mr. Haraguchi established the WCH group. So I just start to this mobility, this other activity
Mhm.
with Mr. Haraguchi and Miss Fukada. Okay.
Now, WCH, we're talking World Council for Health, just
Yeah.
to make sure that I understand correctly. Okay.
Yeah. James, Dr. Yoshino is a great influencer in Japan. He has his own channel. He has 100,000 subscribers in his YouTube video. And Mr. Hashimoto, he's my friend, and he is making a minutes for today's meeting. And let me introduce Dr. Inoue-san. Inoue-san, すいません. Could you introduce yourself to James?
I have been working in the field of free radical research. And also, 50 years ago, I started my research to produce a safe vaccine. And I'm now emeritus professor of Osaka City University Medical School. So, good morning.
Pleasure to meet you.
Roguski sensei.
Yeah, Dr. Inoue-san published so many books about vaccine issues and corona issues. And also, let me introduce one more person, Mr. Murakami, Dr. Murakami. Murakami-san, are you there?
Yes, I am. Yes, I am. Actually, my name is Yasufumi Murakami, and I am currently Professor Emeritus of Tokyo University of Science. And I have been working on immunology and also oncology and also genomics as well. And I am against to mRNA vaccines, all of the mRNA vaccines. I think it is useless and harmful. Okay, thank you very much.
I share that opinion.
I have completely the same concept with Professor Yasufumi.
Yeah.
And also, may I introduce Dr. Yanagisawa-san, and he's a member of WCH Japan. Yanagisawa-san, could you introduce yourself to James?
He's a leader of the WCH Japan.
Hi, Mr. Roguski. My name is Dr. Atsuya Yanagisawa. I'm a physician and work in practicing nutrition medicine and also the former president of the International Society for Orthopedic Medicine. And we launched the Japanese Council of the World Council of Health in this September and start to work for activity against IHR and also the pandemic treaty. And I'm very interested and happy to be here with you and really happy to listening to your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, let me introduce Mr. Oikawa. People call him Japanese Tucker Carlson. He's a very much influential person in Japanese society. Oikawa-san, could you introduce yourself, please?
Hello, doctor. My name is Yuki Oikawa. Actually, I have been focusing on this issue, including the World Health Organization and also World Council for Health in my channel on social media in Japanese language. So I have many concerns about this issue, and now it's time to wake up for Japanese people. So that's why we need more information. So I think this meeting could help. So
I
thank you for having me.
certainly hope it will. And just to be clear, I'm not sure if that was directed at me, but I'm not a doctor. I'm not a lawyer. I'm just an average person who finds myself in an interesting situation. I've done a lot of research in my years. And so if anyone else, or do you want me to just get started?
Let me introduce two more persons. Mr. Ishida-san. Ishida-san, could you introduce yourself? And he's a great influencer in Japan. He has 200,000 subscribers in his YouTube channel. 石田さん、ミュートになってる。ミュート外すよ。ミュートの解除。
こんにちは。Good morning. I talk about Middle East politics and economy by YouTube, and I am old friend with Fukada-san. I want to know about vaccine and vaccine truth and pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Kuroishi-san, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, good morning. My name is Kuroishi. I'm an advisor of Minamide-san. Minamide-san is Osaka Izumi Otsushi mayor. He's very good public influencer with collaborating Inoue Sensei, Murakami Sensei, Yanagi Sensei, others. Thanks.
Nice to meet you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you all of you. And today I invited all very influential people from Japan for James, because as we discussed last time, I want to push Japanese government to disclose more information about pandemic treaty and IHR modification draft. So could you, James, could you tell us about the issue, how we can negotiate with Japanese government to disclose more information about IHR working draft?
Okay, I will dive right in, and I encourage anyone who has questions, please feel free to ask them. I actually think of questions as a contribution. It's very important for people to hopefully walk away from this feeling that all of your questions have been answered. I put my contact information in the chat. Please feel free to reach out to me at any point in time. This is such a big topic. I'm happy to give all the time that you need here. I believe you scheduled 2 hours. Is that correct? Or
原口先生、今日一応2時間取ってるんですけれど、どれくらいの時間皆さんご余裕ありますか？
Okay. 2 hours. Okay.
I was just asking. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm gonna try to condense it, and then
Yeah.
hopefully people will have questions so that everyone walks away with feeling that every question that you have has a legitimate answer. So, in regards to what these negotiations even are and why they're happening, okay, I think there has been in the alternative media an enormous disservice by the vast majority of what people believe they know about these negotiations is probably wrong. Now, I can't get into each one of your minds and know and see this the way you see it, but from what I see in the alternative media, the information that almost everybody has is inaccurate. And so one of the hardest things to do is to erase what you think you already know. But if you could imagine walking into a classroom with a blackboard that has just been perfectly erased and you start from blank slate, the reason why these negotiations are happening, if you go back to 2020, whatever it was that happened in 2020, whatever people want to believe COVID really was, I'll put that aside. That's a whole nother discussion. But at the beginning of 2021, the general prevailing belief was that this new technology, these mRNA vaccines, if 2 or 3 jabs could be gotten into everybody on Earth, then life would go back to normal, and there was a lot of faith put into having an injection given to everybody on the planet. But halfway through 2021, it became obvious to some of the relatively less wealthy nations that the more wealthy nations were getting contracts for large numbers of injections. And there was a disparity in how the available jabs were being distributed. And they typically refer to that as inequity. It was being inequitably distributed. And so they called for a second World Health Assembly that met at the end of November, December 1st, a little more than 2 years ago, 2021. And the instructions that came out of that meeting is what's governing these negotiations. And I honestly think the vast majority of people have lost sight of why these negotiations are actually happening. And they were essentially got together and they directed the WHO to begin negotiations to come to an agreement that ensured equitable access to pandemic-related products. Now, if you transport yourself back to 2021 and erase everything that you have come to know about the drugs and the jabs as to whether or not they are beneficial or harmful, if you can imagine the mindset of somebody who believes that the jabs were going to save lives and those injections were being gobbled up by the wealthy nations and the poor nations were not getting their fair share, you can see how this negotiation started. It's got nothing to do with health. Now, a number of people here are in the health profession. And let me tell you, they are not discussing anything of concern that is your expertise. They are not talking about the proper way to treat a patient who is ill. They are not asking any questions whatsoever about what did they do wrong over the past 4 years. Calling this a negotiation about health, referring to it as the World Health Organization, or the international health regulations will confuse you, because that is not what they are talking about. They're negotiating a trade dispute. They're arguing about intellectual property and benefits to be gained by sharing an identified pathogen with pandemic potential. Now, if you can compartmentalize how you think about this, if you look at what these negotiations are, if you realize that it should have been conducted in the World Trade Organization. And some of the people who are participating in the negotiations have said exactly that, in public in these discussions. And so there's a sticking point in the negotiations right now, because the wealthy nations in general, where the pharmaceutical companies are centered, do not want to give up intellectual property rights to enable relatively poor nations to manufacture their own mRNA jabs. And, partly, honestly, this is an opinion, they don't really want to talk about how these things are actually produced, because those secrets are very incriminating. And the negotiations have hit a difficult point. And so one of the questions that you had asked is, how do you get your government to give more information about what's being negotiated? Well, at the moment, to be honest and blunt and maybe sound like which I'm not, but to sound like I'm supporting what's going on there, with the amendments, they've been negotiating for over a year. And there are rumors that interim documents have been shared where, a new version, a new draft or whatever. But to be fair, in the middle of a negotiation, prior to making a decision as to what the final version might be, it's hard to say what is actually going on. And the interesting part of what's going on here with the negotiations for the amendments to the international health regulations, as opposed to the other document, back in October, they had a meeting of the working group, and the co-chair publicly said that they know that their deadline to submit a final version is January 27th, 2024. So not quite a month from now. And the reason for that is Article 55 of the International Health Regulations says very clearly that any nation can submit amendments to the IHR, but they have to do so 4 months before the World Health Assembly. Well, the World Health Assembly meets on May 27th, 2024. So 4 months before that would be January 27th. And they said back in October that they're not going to meet an agreement, and they're not going to meet their deadline. And so to ask them for details of a document that they cannot agree on, it's not likely to happen. The governments around the world, we've had many people put in freedom of information requests, and their response is always generally, well, we don't want to cause conflict with our negotiating partners, and we can't show you. So they generally say, we're not going to tell you. Okay. And I can personally understand that. But as of January 27th, 2024, if they do not publicly present to the WHO a final version that we can all see, then they do not get to make decisions in May. They would have to postpone it to 2025. And so if you read Article 55 of the International Health Regulations, it's very clear. I've I can certainly send you all of the details, afterwards. Be happy to do that.
Yeah.
So for the amendments, there's hundreds of pages of amendments that have been proposed more than a year ago. There's a 100-page review committee report about those 100 amendments, and they've been negotiating them for a year. And the deadline for them to present the final version to be considered is January 27th. And so
one question.
I was just about to ask you if anybody had any questions.
Yeah.
So go right ahead.
That deadline is for IHR amendment or pandemic treaty? Both?
Just the IHR amendments.
Okay.
Right. And so I think it would be good to compartmentalize and divide what we're talking about, because what happens is people talk about the amendments and then they talk about the new agreement, and it all gets confused. So if we can open it up for questions about what I just said about the amendments, is there any questions that anyone might have? I don't think you're going to get your government to reveal the current status. It would make more sense to let it be very clear that once January 27th, 2024 passes, at that point in time, if a final version has not been submitted, then nothing should be allowed to happen in 2024. They would have to work for 2025.
Okay. We have a chance to ask our government after 27th January next year, if the government doesn't have any final version of modification version of IHR, they cannot change anything about it. They don't have any right, according to IHR Article 55.
Correct. Now, I think you could ask that question in advance, and give the alert to anyone in your government. It'll take them a while to, understand something that they don't really want to deal with. But it's so very clear. Now, the working group, if we, the people of the world, let them, have very clearly in public stated that they plan on ignoring that rule. And they have scheduled meetings for February, and they've scheduled meetings for April. And they have spoken in public about continuing the negotiations. And that would be fine if they gave a report in May and said, well, we're busy negotiating. We were not able to meet the deadline. We're still working on it. Here's the current status of where we are. We'll see you next year. Okay. But they are likely to attempt to just ignore that rule and not let anybody see what their, final version is, and wait up until the last minute and present it at the assembly. Now, a little tiny bit of American politics. Maybe you folks have heard of Nancy Pelosi, former Speaker of the House. She's relatively infamous with a piece of legislation that was like 1,000 pages long. She told members of Congress and others, oh, you don't need to read it. Just vote for it, and then you can read it after it's been enacted. And, that's just wrong. That's not how this is supposed to happen. But that's the kind of thing that if we don't clearly let it be known that we're not going to stand for that, they would be likely to try to do that. And I think that would be, completely against the international rules in the IHR itself.
As you told me last time, and and I told you last time, we joined the meeting to discuss about the IHR amendment issue and the pandemic treaty issue back in, I think around the 10th December, because Congressman Haraguchi invited us, and we questioned to the Minister of Health and Welfare, and I requested them, how can I see the working draft of IHR? And they told me it's not disclosed. So I think I can write an inquiry letter to the government after the Japanese Parliament open next year. I think around the 20th January. I can question when they will have a final version of IHR amendment. So we can make it clear, right? At least.
Very, very much agreed. Now, one of the questions that has come up, and since there are 196 states parties, okay, there's 194 member nations in the WHO, but 2 additional countries, Liechtenstein and the Vatican, are party to the international health regulations. So, it's helpful to just recognize that we're dealing with 2 separate international agreements. There's the agreement that nations have where they join the WHO, but the international health regulations are their own set of international law. And 2 nations that are not members of the WHO are also party to the IHR. And so a simple vote of a majority would be such that the World Health Assembly would consider it to have been adopted. And so one of the interesting issues that's going on is the various nations have submitted their proposals. Now, interestingly, Japan is listed as having submitted proposed amendments. It was detailed at one point which articles they had submitted amendments in regards to, but their actual document, the document that Japan submitted, I have never been able to find. It is very, very secret. Now, all of the other nations back in mid-December of 2022, there are documents of what all of the other nations submitted, and Japan's submitted amendments are invisible. I've never come across anybody who has seen them. You can determine which article they supposedly put forth amendments to, but that is very unusual that their original submission has been left out of everyone else's submitted documents. So that might be a question worthy of.
Okay, I will add that question to inquiry letter.
The
It's
situation
surprising
in
us.
Japan is very critical. I'd like to share a shocking fact. There is only one member of the Japanese parliament who served as an ambassador to the WHO. And that is Mr. Keizo Takemi. He is also the Minister of Health, Labor and Welfare under the Kishida administration. Very critical. Thank you.
One of the questions that I have for you, because I do not know the answer, but I have researched this in a number of other countries. Okay. In the United States, most people understand with our Constitution, it says that the Senate is supposed to give by 2/3 vote their consent for any international agreement. But for decades, they have not bothered to ask the Senate to do that. And that's an interesting argument in United States politics. Thousands of agreements have just been signed by the president without ever asking the Senate. Now, in Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, their constitution and their laws say that the parliament has absolutely zero. They have nothing, no input whatsoever into the decision-making process as to whether or not to enter into an international agreement. The executive branch, the prime minister, the foreign minister, health minister, they make the decision. And parliament may then be directed to enact or to pass enacting legislation to implement whatever the obligations of the agreement are. But in those countries, parliament does not have anything to say about whether or not the decision to agree is made. Now, I'll transition a little bit into talking about not just the amendments, but the proposed new agreement. They now call it the pandemic agreement, okay? Most people call it the pandemic treaty, but you got to get the words correct, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But most people understand, oh, that is a new document, and they feel like, well, that's got to be treated differently. But in Australia and New Zealand and Canada, not really. Parliament in those nations has no say as to whether or not the executive branch of their government makes that decision. So I encourage everybody to divide in your, or separate in your mind. There's the lawful authority in your constitution and your law as to who is it that makes that decision. And Parliament may very well be told, okay, we've made this decision. You have to pass legislation to make sure that we are in compliance with the decision that you did not get to make. And in those nations, people don't want to believe that. It's a shock to them that the people and their representatives have no say. Now, I don't know the structure in Japan. My apologies. I would have to ask people, to look into that. Almost everybody in Australia is completely confused.
Yeah.
They cannot separate those two functions.
I checked the Japanese constitution. There is Article 98. Actually, when our government, I mean prime minister or other minister of welfare, and they don't need to talk to parliament to make agreement with foreign countries. We are in the same situation. That is shocking to me.
It is. And, all due respect, right, to our member of parliament, in Australia, they spend a lot of time trying to reach out to members of parliament to influence them, not understanding that there's nothing they can do. Now, there's always political pressure and, people who have relationships and they have conversations and they come to an understanding. But legally, if what you said is the case, how do people in that situation influence what is going on? Okay. And now the other aspect of it, generally, it's the foreign minister who has the ultimate authority. And for all of the folks here who are in the medical profession, my apologies, none of this has anything to do with health. This is a trade dispute. And so why the health ministers in all of these nations are negotiating a trade issue is an interesting question. Even if they had expertise about vaccines and medications and treatment, they're not investigating any of that. Even if the bureaucrats from the health ministry who are delegates to the WHO were valid experts, it doesn't matter. That's not what they're negotiating. They're talking about TRIPS waivers and intellectual property. And one of the things, I'll get into a little bit of the details from the original submissions in these amendments. Interestingly, both Bangladesh and the African nations as a group submitted amendments to Article 13A. It's a new article that they would like to create. And it's interesting that Bangladesh and all the African nations, their proposals were very, very similar. And those articles, Article 13A from both countries, actually addresses the trade dispute and the unequal manner in which products were distributed in 2021. Now, their solution is about as Marxist totalitarian of a solution that you could possibly imagine. Their solution would be to empower the Director General, if he was to declare a public health emergency, he would then create an allocation mechanism. He would immediately be empowered to decide what products were needed. Honestly, as if that's even possible if you have a new disease. It would be impossible to know what should be done. But he would be empowered to make that decision and then tell whatever nation had the capacity to provide that set of products, Japan, the United States, United Kingdom, Germany, whomever, that they would need to manufacture what he tells them to manufacture and provide it to the nation that needs it. Now, in a perfect world, that sounds wonderful. Okay. Someone here has a problem and someone there knows how to make something to help the problem. They would make it and give it to them. But this would have set up the Director General as the sole human on the planet to be empowered to make that decision.
James, hello. Hi. About the new Article 13, so many people concerned about as you said, invading or damaging the sovereignty of each countries. However, basically the ILH and the new pandemic treaty will respect the sovereignty of each country. So,
if I may comment on that, because you have to really get into some details about that. It's a complicated answer. Let me let you finish your question, but
please.
No, you were going to say something more.
Oh, okay. So, for example, the articles, maybe Article 3 or something. Article 3, right? They always insist that the IRH, new IRH, and also pandemic treaty must not invade or damage the sovereignty of each country. However, if you look at the new Article 13, so as you said, the general WHO will have the incredible power to change the situation. So, which is right? So, WHO can control the world or not?
I think I can give you a suitable answer to this question, and it's interesting, and I find it entertaining because I'm so deep, into it. if you listen very closely to the words that Tedros Ghebreyesus uses when he addresses that issue, he says that the pandemic accord will not infringe on the sovereignty of nations. I've never heard him say the amendments to the international health regulations will not do so. So what happens and what has been happening, unfortunately, is many people in the alternative media have been looking at some of the details that we have from these various documents, and almost universally, they say the treaty is going to do this and the treaty is going to do that. But they're getting details from the amendments. So technically, it's misinformation. So then the Director General makes a public statement and he says, oh, that's misinformation. And then he speaks a partial truth. If you go into the various versions of the pandemic agreement, it says very clearly in there, oh, we respect, sovereignty. Well, you have to realize this isn't what you think it is. This is a big business venture. They're not negotiating health. They're negotiating, you're going to invest in infrastructure in poor nations, and they're going to give you pathogens, and then you're going to share the products that you make with them. Okay. And so Tedros is able to very skillfully speak something that is true, but incomplete. And people don't have the details. Now, to add a little bit more to this, okay, very clearly, what I just said about Tedros being able to tell this country that they have to manufacture something and give it to that country, that's not going to infringe upon my personal freedoms if they figure out some way to pay for all of that. That's just a business deal, right? Now, what has happened is in the other agreement, in the pandemic agreement, there's a totally different solution, if you want to call it that, where they want to create, instead of that sort of communist, Marxist dictator, you have to do what I tell you and give it to those people. Instead of that, they want to set up a different structure in the pandemic agreement, right? And let me leave that for talking about the pandemic agreement, because I don't want to confuse all of the details there with what's in the amendments. And so when Bangladesh said they wanted Article 13A, well, that wouldn't work if Tedros was put in charge of logistics and he recommended that a country manufacture something and give it to somebody else. So they changed, or they sought to change, the definition of the word recommendation and cross out non-binding. Okay, they wanted Tedros's directive to be a command. You will manufacture this and deliver it where it's needed. But that also would then apply to every other aspect of the international health regulations. And that's problematic. And so at this point, I don't know whether or not that whole, everything that we've just been talking about, we have no way of knowing after a year of negotiation whether any of that is still being considered. And so I have cautioned people since February, be careful about talking about the details because we don't know what they are. Now, I would imagine that the Director General is briefed on the status of the negotiations, and he knows what may or may not be currently what they're considering. And so I think a lot of people are putting themselves in a very dangerous position in the sense that they're saying things that I see a trick being played, possibly, where they might have a very watered down version of the amendments that they try to push through. And maybe those things like the allocation mechanism and recommendations being mandatory, maybe those things are long gone because they were recommended against back in February. And the thing that nobody seems to be paying attention to is what I think they really want from the amendments, in addition to many other things, is what they call the Global Digital Health Certification Network. Most people would call that a vaccine passport, but it's more than just vaccines. They want a vaccine certificate, a prophylaxis certificate, a testing certificate, a recovery certificate, and there's no way to define what those things are. They're not even bothering. Now, those are supposedly being negotiated, but nobody talks about them. And if you go and do a search for WHO Global Digital Health Certification Network, they have a whole page on their website. They're building the network. They're building that software system. They inherited the European Union's system. The carcass of the software was handed over to them when they were done with it. And while they're supposedly negotiating that, they're busy building it. Now, what they're likely to do is put it out as a voluntary system. Oh, does Japan wish to volunteer to sign up to use this Global Digital Health Certification Network? Here it is. They would love to have it be mandatory, but the concern is they're building it anyways. And so, is your government likely to say, oh, gee, thank you. Isn't that nice of the WHO to make an international digital system to track and trace and restrict travel? Okay. Whether or not they pass the amendments, I think they're busy building that system. And if they can't make it mandatory via the international health regulations, it's likely to be voluntary. And voluntary things often quickly become accepted as mandatory.
質問いいです。
どうぞ。
Mr. Roguski, I have a fundamental question. Yeah. The other day, I attended the Japanese WCH Parliamentary League established Mr. Haraguchi. So I get papers named WHO Pandemic Agreement. If the pandemic agreement, we can give up this agreement, but this is treaty or agreement, I wonder. Treaties and agreement have a completely different meaning. So this is a common practice used by WHO trick. This is a treaty or agreement.
The trick is even better. Okay, it's neither one of those. It's really a framework convention. Okay, in Article 19 of the WHO Constitution, that gives the WHO the authority to negotiate a convention or an agreement. Now, there's an example of this that I dug up a year and a half ago. The WHO has already put forth a number of years ago, I think about 20 years ago, the Framework Convention for the Control of Tobacco. And when I first looked at that, the format of it, just visually, graphically, the way the document looked and felt, it was as if they just took that, copied it, and started putting information about pandemics in it. That's the kind of document that they have been saying from the very beginning, that they want a framework convention for pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. Now, a convention is structured where, again, the question about whether or not it's going to hand over sovereignty to the WHO, the answer for this one is a little trickier, because when Tedros says that the pandemic accord is not going to hand over sovereignty to the WHO, he's speaking correctly. The game that they would be playing is that they would set up a conference of the parties, a totally new bureaucracy. Each nation would choose a delegate to participate in this yearly conference. So you're not losing your sovereignty, you're sending a delegate. Okay? And that power is not going to the WHO, it's not going to the Director General. So he's telling the truth, but what he's not telling you is, think about the Framework Convention for Climate Change that was agreed to by the UN in 1992. That is, they just had their 28th meeting, and each nation sends a delegate. So you're still sovereign, you're still sending your representative. Here's what they don't tell you. The people and members of parliament have no say in what those unelected delegates decide when they go to the Conference of the Parties. Well, who contributes to those discussions? The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Wellness Trust, corporations, anybody but the people have an influence in the protocols that the Conference of the Party, year after year after year after year, will decide. And then, since if somebody signs on to that agreement, Parliament would be obligated to enact legislation to be in compliance with whatever those unelected people decided. A framework convention, I think, honestly, it comes straight from Satan. I mean, it's an evil, evil document where you agree to let unknown people make decisions for you in the future. It's kind of like if you were going to sign a contract for a business deal and they put a whole bunch of blank pieces of paper in the contract and said, oh, don't worry about that. We'll have our people fill in all of the blanks next year. Just go ahead and sign. And then you would be obligated to the decisions that are made the next year and the next year and the next year. It's not about sovereignty. It's about representation of the will of the people being totally separated from this new bureaucracy. And unfortunately, nobody has really explained that in the alternative media. It's been frustrating. Technically, they're not taking away your sovereignty. They're separating the will of the people and their representation in parliament from this process.
I see.
And they certainly are not asking doctors, how do you best make people healthy? That's got nothing to do with it.
主権の問題ではなくて白紙委任になっちゃうっていうことが問題なんですね。あとは議会も通らないのでどうやって止めるかっていう。
If I may, the vast majority, other than what I just said about the Conference of the Parties, the vast majority of what we've been talking about were the amendments, okay? So the agreement, I'll talk about that for a little bit now. There have been at least 5 versions that have been made public. Okay. And so unlike the amendments, which they let us see the original proposals, except for Japan, since those original proposals, it's been complete secrecy. No version 2.0, no working draft, nothing. With the treaty, they've had one in July of 2022, one in November, one in February, one in June, one in October. And the current status is they had a meeting in December and they gave instructions again to the Bureau, which is the 6 members, one from each region, that are in charge of the intergovernmental negotiating body. They're shooting for the end of February to come up with another draft of whatever you want to call it. I'll just call it the treaty, even though I think that's not the right word. It's the framework convention. Quietly in the background, many, many, many nations are very unhappy, primarily because of what really became obvious back in April. I've watched as many of the meetings as they've made public, and in early April, typically what they do is they have a little public meeting on Monday, then they disappear into secret meetings all week long, and then they come back on Friday to close up and do their final little thing. And in April, when they came back to their final Friday meeting, it was very clear that people were not happy. And they were having difficulty reaching any kind of agreement. And so what they decided to do at the beginning of April was they said to all of the nations, by April 22nd, please submit whatever text you want to add to the document that we're working on, which they did. But rather than have this compilation text, all of the information from all of the nations, what ultimately happened, not during the assembly, they didn't do this during the assembly, they did it generally right at the beginning and right after. They put forth what they called the Bureau's draft or the Bureau's text. It has never been made public, the 208-page compilation text, which is what all of the nations said that they wanted. The Bureau edited that down to a 43-page text. They published that in June, and June, July, August, September, the nations were considerably unhappy that their submissions from April were not included in the document that was being discussed. It got to the point where they said in September, look, we're not happy with this. We want our information to be in this document. Go rewrite it. Now, one would have thought that the 43-page document would have grown to be larger to include the input from the 208 pages. But in October, it actually got smaller. It went down to 30 pages. And the nations are visibly unhappy, and they said so. And the document says on the title that it is a proposal for a pandemic agreement, a proposal to be considered as a negotiating text. But the Bureau and the WHO, they keep calling it the negotiating text. And so many nations are upset. They're saying, no, we did not agree that this would even be the foundation to be negotiating. And so they're back to the drawing board. maybe at the end of January sometime, probably to confuse the deadline with the amendments. They may very well present a new version of the agreement in advance of their February meeting. But at this point, there's a lot of nations who are not happy that their submissions are being rejected by the bureaucracy that is running the negotiations. And so whenever I hear them say that this is a member nation-led negotiating process, personally, I'm disgusted because that is just a lie. The bureaucrats in the WHO, in the Intergovernmental Negotiating Body, somebody is pulling their strings, probably the United States, the European Union, the United Kingdom, whomever it may be. They are not conducting honest and fair negotiations. And if I was a representative of any of the smaller nations, personally, I think, I'm a very easygoing guy, but I would have walked out a long time ago because these are not honest negotiations, not at all.
James, going back to the new group of representative of each country, so I've heard they will take a responsibility of censoring the world opinion in maybe alternative media, and they have already set up the relationship with that kind of the company to censor the all media and the social media to pick up the dangerous opinion. So this information is correct or not?
There have been many versions of the agreement, the proposed pandemic treaty. In the previous version, that concept, that issue was much worse. Okay. In the newer version, which is smaller, it went from 43 to 30 pages. That article got a lot of words removed from it. It's still bad, but it's less bad than it was. But again, you have to remember, this is not about health. Okay. This is a business deal to bring investment into the pharmaceutical hospital emergency industrial complex. They don't want the truth to get in the way of their business model. They want the WHO to police any criticism. Oh, there's side effects. Oh, it doesn't work, so forth and so on. And so the way it's worded and the way it has worked in operation is governments have essentially gotten corporations to do their censoring for them. And when you look at, where the advertising revenue comes from, I had an experience years ago where I learned very clearly that, media companies don't care about their viewers. They care about their advertising revenue. And, the amount of money that is coming from pharmaceutical industry advertising, they control the media.
I see.
And so by setting up the WHO as this all-knowing, everything they say must be correct, it gives them cover to say, oh, well, the WHO said this, which is highly unlikely that it would ever conflict with a pharmaceutical company that's donating money or paying for advertising. And so the corruption, really, I don't typically throw these words around, but that is the definition of fascism, is corporations and government working together to take away the rights and freedoms of people. And so that is in there. It was way worse it's still bad. So, you know, if someone had talked about that, I did a whole article on censorship back in June, where, you know, any media outlet should have been reporting on that proposed article. It's atrocious that it should. What does that got to do with pandemics? What does that got to do with saving lives? You know, really, that the WHO should be the arbiter of all things that are true. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yes.
To go a little further into the agreement, okay? The main problem that I see, I've already talked about, where it would set up a conference of the parties and they would just make decisions going forward. But the main core of what is in the current proposal is they want to set up this pathogen access and benefit sharing system. Now, the idea comes from, I used to manage an herb and nutrition store, and so I'm very knowledgeable about herbs and natural healing. And a lot of indigenous cultures learn about plants and chemicals and how to use those for healing. And in 1992, there was a biodiversity convention that was adopted so that pharmaceutical companies couldn't just come into a nation, get that indigenous knowledge about various plants, and then change the chemical a little bit so that they could patent it and then go and make $1 billion drug. There's supposed to be a sharing, right? You know, you gain access to the wisdom, but then you share the benefits. So that idea, Indonesia, 15 years ago or so, identified a new strain of influenza, and they did not want to share it because they realized that all of these pharmaceutical companies are making billions of dollars. And that set up the PIP network. And the idea, coupled with a concept called the One Health approach, is they pushed this agenda that, oh, it wasn't a leak from a biolab in Wuhan. You know, somebody went to a wet market and had some bat soup, and, you know, it's zoonotic transfer from animals to humans. They want people to believe that so that they can always be searching through the countryside on farms and in the wild, you know, for pigs or chickens or cow or any other animal you could imagine, looking for pathogens that might cross over and jump species to infect humans. Those pathogens are a financial windfall. And the nations are looking at that as a natural resource. Now, I don't know if y'all folks know this, but the bacteria that produces naturally ivermectin was discovered on a Japanese golf course, is my understanding.
You're right.
Now, that should be a resource that was owned by the Japanese people.
I see.
And any money that was made from that discovery, you know, should have been shared with the Japanese people. But I'm pretty sure that's not how it worked out. Merck took that chemicals from the bacteria, changed it a little bit, patented it, and who knows how much money they've made on it. Well, the treaty would set up a pathogen access and benefit sharing system. They want nations to go searching everywhere to find, you know, Ebola or Marburg or, you know, polio or whatever. If they identify a pathogen, and literally this is their phrase, with pandemic potential, and they sequence the genome and share that information, various corporations can turn that into drugs or injectables. And the last version of it was 10% of whatever is made would be given to the WHO by the companies that make it. If they sign an agreement, to get the information in turn, 10% would be given at cost. Well, the relatively poor nations who would be obligated to build the laboratories to do the genomic sequencing and have people, doing surveillance of bacterial outbreaks, they don't think 20% is enough. So they're haggling over, well, wait a minute. If we go find a new pathogen with potential, okay, bring it into a biolab and help the pharmaceutical companies turn it into what I believe are biological weapons, they want more than 20%. And so you can understand that that's not how you make people healthier. That's how you find the next pandemic and profit from it. So the entire negotiations are designed to profiteer from the concept of the next pandemic. It's open for questions if you have any.
どうですか、ご質問は。ちょっとなんか衝撃的すぎるというか。
I think this is very, very, very dangerous. So, yeah. I think that structure is very dangerous.
Now,
initiating pandemic will produce a lot of money. So, yeah.
That's what this is about.
Yeah, this is a very dangerous structure.
It sounds like this is a pure trade agreement. This shouldn't be under the Minister of Healthcare and Welfare. I think this should be in charge of Ministry of Industry and Economy.
At the very least, all aspects of society are involved in any kind of response to such a problem. And I totally agree with you. To have it be handled by the health minister is very narrow-minded.
If it is a treaty, there should be parliamentary procedures such as signing and ratification. However, if there are no approval procedures for what is called the pandemic treaty, is right?
I'll try to answer that question.
It cannot be considered a treaty. That is what I believe.
Well, you had mentioned earlier, Moe, that in the Constitution, it's under the control. You had mentioned that you're similar to Australia and New Zealand and Canada and so forth. And so I have not put my eyes on Japanese constitution or Japanese law in terms of how international agreements are handled in your legal system. Okay.
Same as America and stuff like that.
It may very well be, but without having actually put my eyes on it and seeing what it says, in almost every nation where I've looked at this information, the people in that nation are completely surprised by what the law and the Constitution actually says. Okay. And so I wouldn't do it on faith. I wouldn't do it on someone else's analysis. I would say, by all means, read it for yourself. And it's very easy with the international health regulations. In 1969, when they were adopted, nobody voted on it. In 2005, when a large package of amendments totally changed it, nobody voted on it. Nobody asked Parliament. Nobody asked the Senate. In 2022, they pretended to vote, and our Senate and Congress, not one senator and not one member of Congress said one word about the amendments from 2022. So whatever the law may say, the reality is amendments were proposed and purported to be adopted in 2022. Did anybody in any parliament anywhere in the world say a single word about it? The reality of it is no proactive approval from any parliament anywhere on the planet was needed. The way the WHO structured the international health regulations, which I think is totally wrong, but the way it works is a bunch of unelected bureaucrats go to Geneva, they make a decision, and unless somebody says no, we reject it, silence is viewed as consent. And so nations around the world have just been silent. A period of time passes. Too late. You missed your opportunity. And that's most likely what they would try to do again. There's nothing in the international health regulations that says, oh, if we agree to amendments, you have to go back to your national parliament and get their approval. That's not written anywhere. And that's not what they've been doing. It should be, but it isn't. And that's the part that people don't want to understand. Now, if I may, if we have time, anybody who's in the health professions, okay, the regulations are supposedly come under not Article 19, which is for conventions or agreements, but the regulations come under Article 21 in the WHO Constitution. And there are 5 things that the WHO supposedly, and I'm sorry, I misspoke, the World Health Assembly has the authority to write regulations about. And for 76 years, they have completely failed to ever write a single regulation that's legally binding about the things I'm about to mention. They have the authority to write regulations for terminology, but they've never legally defined a vaccine or a pandemic or safe or effective, and many other words. They have the authority to set standards for cause of death. And if you look back over the last 4 years, did somebody die with or from COVID? There's no standard that they ever set. They have the authority to set standards and write regulations for diagnostic testing requirements. They've never done so. If you know anything about the PCR, and all the other tests too, for that matter, they have the authority to set standards for purity of biological and pharmaceutical products. If you're aware of DNA plasmids being in and heavy metal contamination, they've never set regulations for standards for purity. And last but not least, they have the right to set regulations and standards for advertising and labeling. And labeling includes the insert that people are supposed to be able to read that tells you all of the potential adverse events and all that. Many of those were blank. And so the negotiations that they should be doing are to write regulations for the things I just mentioned. And they're not doing any of that, because it's not about, if it was about health, they would be doing death certificates and diagnostics and purity and labeling and all that. It's a business deal. They're just trying to figure out how to profit from the next pandemic.
I see.
I hope that any questions you might have, I hope I've answered. I'm
Yeah.
certainly available anytime if I can
Okay.
help in any way. You know, I put my contact information.
Yeah.
I certainly don't know everything, but I do know this topic pretty well.
Yeah.
If you want me to try to speak with someone on your behalf to, you know, answer any questions, I'm at your service. You know, anything I can do to help you.
Thank you so much. This is not just a health issue, but a business related to pathogen by large pharmaceutical companies. Wow, it's very
That's right.
shocking.
Yeah. Very shocking.
Very shocking. Thank you so much.
Yep. No,
Yeah. So much.
it's frightening. You know, I have to live in the same world.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it's if you go back to the mindset
I see.
2 years ago,
Yeah.
people were very afraid,
Mhm.
and it was presented that these mRNA jabs were going to save lives. And the poor nations were not receiving any of this life-saving, okay? That's what started the discussion.
I see.
And if it was food and water, right? If the wealthy nations had gobbled up contracts for all of the food and water on the planet, and the poor nations were not able to get enough food and water, you could understand the reasoning, okay? But they're so deep into this now, and it's become such a profit-driven idea. The people who are in the middle of these negotiations absolutely cannot come out and say, oh, wait a minute, never mind. We don't want any of these mRNA jabs. They're really bad for you. Because there's billions of dollars being discussed. And if they don't get a piece of the pie for their home country, okay, they're not going to have their job. It's not about making people healthier. It's about, I mean, they can't afford to lose face by being involved in negotiations that are absolutely insane. They're arguing for more poisonous jabs that they can manufacture in their own country to inflict upon their own people. For them to admit that this whole thing is insane would be so embarrassing. They cannot possibly ever say that.
James, so I understand there are many secret working group meetings and the details of the current situation of amending IRH. We don't know what's happening at the moment. However, there are so many information in alternative media. I understand there are many misinformations in that kind of media.
Yeah.
So do you know how we can get a correct information? So although they are still secret, but there are many the part of the information of amendment. So how we can get that kind of things?
I will put a link in the chat as soon as I find it. There's a group called the Third World Network, and their website, anyways, is based out of Malaysia. Let me temper my answer by saying I don't know what the entire truth is. You know, I'm not there in the meetings to listen and report. But the Third World Network, they do have representatives that are considered relevant stakeholders. and they do attend the meetings that they are allowed to attend. So they interact with the delegates. And there's a lot of articles. I'm waiting for them. They haven't published anything since 3 weeks ago. They bring a view that is from the third world. It's the Third World Network. That's the name of their group. So I put that link in the chat. They give a very different perspective from their viewpoint. And most of what they're complaining about, they want more jabs. They want more investment. They want, they're the driving force. So you'll be reading the viewpoint from the negotiating side of this that wants more investment in this pharmaceutical industry. Okay. So you have to, take it all, however you want to interpret it, but they are not happy with the way the negotiations have been handled. And they haven't written anything for 3 weeks. And I know it's been the holidays and such, but I'm waiting to see what they have to say, because what was supposed to happen, what the original plan was with the amendments, was that the meeting on December 7 and 8 was supposed to be their final meeting. They were supposed to have everything all finished. And then they were going to submit whatever they had to the International Health Regulations Review Committee. They were supposed to be reviewing it over the holidays and into January. And it was then supposed to be submitted in mid-January. Well, they're not doing any of that as far as I know. And but hopefully that group will give you some interesting insight. They've written a lot of articles through the last year and a half. Very different view than you get elsewhere.
Sounds very interesting. Their group has their own website or something?
I put it in the chat. It's TWN for Third World Network .malaysia.my. And I put the direct link to their health articles in the chat. And so, but they are what's considered to be a relevant stakeholder. So they send a delegate to Geneva who participates in the meetings. Most of the meetings they're not allowed to participate in, but they do get to participate in some. But, they're literally in the building. So they do have the opportunity to speak to the other delegates. And a lot of the other delegates want to complain because they're not happy, but they don't want to do it publicly. Diplomatic reasons and all that. So
thank you.
I hope I've answered everyone's questions. I'm sure at some point you'll have another question, but I'm certainly available in any way if I can help you at all.
他にもご質問は、I think we questioned everything about our question this moment, but what we received from you today is much bigger than we expected, and we are struggling with digesting on it. So
on one level, it's easier. On one level, it's easier because in regards to the amendments, they have a deadline of January 27th.
Yeah.
After January 27th, they will have either submitted a document that is their final presentation to be considered in May, or they haven't. Now, I don't really talk too much about the details because I don't know what the heck is in the document. They're likely to fail to meet their deadline. And so as far as the amendments are concerned, to me, it's null and void. They have no right to agree to anything if they failed to meet the legal obligation to submit it 4 months in advance. Now, they'll argue and they'll try to cheat, but that makes it easy. Now, with the pandemic agreement, they are currently rewriting the latest version, which was from October, and they're hoping to present it sometime the end of January. I can already see it coming. People are going to get confused. They're going to present a new agreement, which is not the amendments. And the vast majority of the population are going to be all confused. But until that new agreement is made public, and then they're going to have marathon, I mean, their words, marathon 2-week sessions twice in February and March, I believe. I don't even bother talking about the details for the most part because they're changing. Okay. Now, the problem with the agreement is they don't have this 4-month deadline. They can negotiate right up until May, and they probably will need to do so. But I would encourage you to find out as certainly as you can, if you have the resources, to get people to look at how have other international agreements or treaties been dealt with by Parliament, and how were the amendments in 2005 handled. I would be very surprised if Parliament was even consulted. It was probably just allowed to just quietly enter into force.
Thank you so much.
Well,
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
I have another question.
Good.
James, my African friends said to me, they doesn't get vaccine like messenger RNA vaccine because they know that what the G7 countries recommended to them is not good. So this year, the GDP of the G7 countries has been surpassed by the GDP of the BRICS. They are not getting vaccine like messenger RNA vaccine. Wouldn't it be impossible to impose big pharma's business agreement on them? What do you think?
That's a complex question. I'll try to answer it directly, but first I'm going to give you my initial gut response. Okay.
Okay.
I would not be surprised at all if I wake up one morning and I read a newspaper article of the announcement of the creation of the WHO. Why would these nations want to deal with the World Health Organization if the BRICS nations offer them a better deal? Okay. If Russia and China and India and South Africa and Brazil and everybody said, hey, you know what? The United States and the United Kingdom and the European Union, they don't care about us. We don't need the World Health Organization. We're going to take our pharmaceutical companies and we're going to have our own BRICS health organization. Now, you know, you're all involved with the World Council for Health. You understand the concept of the World Health Organization is not making anybody healthier. Okay. What if the BRICS nations said, hey, you know, we like that World Council for Health model. Okay. We're going to do what we want to do. Okay. And so I kind of think that sort of warfare is not the right word. That sort of rearrangement of the global order is happening in these negotiations.
Nice.
Okay. The smaller nations are realizing that the bigger nations don't play fair. And at some point, they could wake up one morning, and if the African nations, and there's a group called the Group for Equity, right? So the African nations, there's 47. The Group for Equity, there's 29. There's a little bit of overlap. So if you put them together, that's 70. If they got 30 Caribbean nations and South Pacific nations, small countries, if they decided, okay, we want what we want, we've got 100 nations. If they submitted amendments to the international amendments to the IHR before January 27th, and they had 100 nations sign on, there's nothing anybody could do to stop it. All they need is a majority. Well, why should they do that with the WHO? Why don't they just do it for themselves? They don't need the WHO. The WHO had a budget in 2022 they spent $3.8 billion, which is actually technically, it's really not a lot of money in the grand scheme of things. 30% of their budget was for salaries. They had 8,851 employees. They earned an average of $120,000 a year. 30% of their budget went for salaries. They spent less than half that amount of money on actual health products. What kind of a deal is that? Why do nations even want to be involved? They could easily get a better deal from almost any other group. So I would not be surprised if this entire process ends up with the smaller nations being driven out of the WHO by the WHO and the way they're behaving. I don't know if that answered your question, but I hope it did.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Well,
James.
let me express my honor at all of you giving me your time. I greatly appreciate it. If I can do anything to help, just let me know.
Thank you so much. All of us really appreciate your advice today.
Thank you very much.
So we are going to discuss how we can push and squeeze our government from now on. So
Wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Well, have a wonderful new year. Yep. Take care. All the best.
Again.
All the best to everybody.
See you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.